Previously on The Complete Creation.
But let me start right there. This simple chart we've all seen, so eloquently depicting the fossil evidence of the evolutionary ascent of ape-like creature to man, the vast majority of people do not know that this fossil sequence is only found in 3 places on the entire planet. Do any of you know where we find this sequence? Only 3 places. Textbooks, museum displays, and the imaginations of people. This sequence does not exist in physical form anywhere on this planet. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me again in this series where we show you the information the anti-creationists don't want you to see or hear. In the last session, we set out to establish what science was and was not, and what the limits of science are. Let's start today by looking at the physical, scientific evidence and the very important history of the creation-evolution debate. You see, it wasn't that long ago, not even 150 years ago, where the consensus of the scientific community was that this book, the Bible, was a literal history book of the world, the universe, and all of life. There was no conflict between the claims of this book and the scientific evidence they dealt with every day. In fact, most of the scientists felt it was their God-given duty and purpose to scientifically explore and understand the universe. They felt that they were to heed the command to Adam to subdue the earth, to understand and control it. Now, to the scientists of the day, it was a fact that all the universe, planets, earth, and all of its life was created by a divine creator only a few thousand years ago. It was all very young. Now, pretty much all of the founding fathers of the modern sciences were what we would call Bible-believing young earth creationists. They believed that the basis of modern science depends on the universe having been created by a rational creator, and thus, at least as originally created, it was an orderly universe. Modern science as we know it today only began to flourish because of the beliefs of these founding fathers. You know, Johann Kepler, Blaise Pascal, Robert Boyle, Nicholas Steno, Isaac Newton, Leonard Euler, Carolus Linnaeus, Michael Faraday, James Joule, Louis Pasteur, James Clerk Maxwell, and many, many others. The scientific evidence did not cause them to question their belief in the Bible or its history of a created universe. It was their belief in the Bible that led them to scientific discovery. But this brings up a very important question that my good friend and geologist, John Mackay, brings up regularly. If creation were true, if this world and universe had been created as the Bible indicates, what would the scientific evidence be? If the 2 models of creation and evolution rule out all other possibilities, then the significance of this question cannot be overstated. In contradistinction, asking what the evidence would be if evolution were true is equally significant. So, if creation were true, what would the evidence be? We would expect to find evidence that the Earth and even the universe is young, in the 6,000 to 10,000 year range. Now, the age of the universe becomes tricky because you have what is called time dilation involved there. Time runs at different speeds at different places in the universe. We would expect to find evidence that life on Earth is young. In the first chapter of Genesis, the first book of the Bible that contains the creation record, 10 times it states that God created life to reproduce after their kind. So, if creation were true, we should see limited variation within species as they faithfully reproduce after their kind. We would expect to find all of life scattered throughout the historical and fossil records from the beginning, as according to the Bible, all of life was created within a single literal week. So we should see evidence that, say, man and dinosaurs lived contemporaneously. They also lived at the same time. Now, one more significant point of evidence comes from Genesis chapter 7, where it records a worldwide flood that destroyed all of life that breathes air. As you'll see in this lecture, this is not just a significant event for the special creation model, but as it turns out, whether this flood happened or not affirms or refutes the evolution model as well. You heard that right. If a global flood happened in Earth's historic past, you can kiss the entire theory of evolution goodbye. That theory has been obliterated, scientifically falsified. You cannot overstate that point. Now, while I recognize that most of you will not see the connection between a historic global flood and the theory of evolution, please be patient. The reasons will become evident. But coming back to our question, if creation were true, what would the evidence be? Our final point would be that if a global flood happened, even remotely close to the description in Genesis chapter 7, then there will be evidence. That's not a maybe, that's a fact. So here we have a good string of evidence to look for to affirm or refute the biblically based creation model. Now, if evolution were the correct model, what would the evidence be? We would find evidence that the earth and life, both extinct and extant, were very old, certainly in the hundreds of millions of years, probably billions of years. We would find biological processes that accommodate major changes in organisms so that one organism could evolve into another. That macro evolution I spoke of in the previous lecture. We would find an order in the billions of years of fossil record of simple life forms evolving into more and more complex life forms over time. As I previously mentioned, all the founding fathers of the modern sciences believed the creation account. Then something happened in the mid-1800s in particular. And I think the history is very important here. If I were to ask you who it was that started the evolution debate, who is the first person that comes to mind? Well, Charles Darwin, of course. The funny thing is, the debate did not start with him. None of his ideas were new. In fact, even his ideas of natural selection were, ironically, plagiarized from a creationist. As Paul Humber documents in his article, Edward Blythe was the author of the natural selection concept, though he never used that term natural selection. And Blythe's published works fully expressed the concepts of natural selection in multiple papers written in the 1830s. Blythe, the curator of the museum at the Royal Asiatic Society of Bengal, was an ardent special creationist. He believed the biblical account of creation and the ideas of natural selection that he wrote about were completely compatible with the model of special creation. Now, as it turns out, not only is natural selection compatible with the biblical account of creation, contrary to what Darwin proposed, natural selection is the nemesis of evolution. We'll look at that in detail probably around lecture 15, but to summarize, natural selection actually opposes evolutionary progression. But before Darwin's time, in the preceding centuries, there was a very few people who believed various forms of evolutionary theory. In fact, there were some even before the time of Christ. The significance of this fact will come to a head in lecture 10. What would Jesus believe? But let's just say that such people were very much considered on the fringe. Unscientific nut jobs, to be frank. The modern day evolution controversy started in a most unusual area. Let me first bring up three men whose names you may or may not know: Martin Luther, Charles Finney, and John Calvin. Luther, many of you will probably recognize, even if only from history and having no knowledge of the Christian church history. But all three men were preachers who rattled the world with their actions and writings, and I would say profoundly impacted the world for the better. All three men also went to school for the same profession. Do any of you know what profession that was? Now, most who know anything about these men, because of their profound influence on the Christian church, assume that they went to school to study theology, but they did not. They went to school to learn to be lawyers. They learned the craft of argumentation. As much as we disdain lawyers, we need to give them credit where credit is due. But do you know who did go to school to learn theology? That's right, Charles Darwin. His only earned degree was in theology. But let me introduce you to another man who profoundly impacted the world, I would say for the worse, and with his writings and his studies addressing religious beliefs. He too went to school to be trained as a lawyer. His name was Sir Charles Lyell, and he became known not as a great lawyer, but as one of the founding fathers of the modern science of geology. He popularized the concept of uniformitarianism proposed by James Hutton. Now, don't let the big words scare you. Just look at the root word, uniform. It was the idea that all geological processes were uniform, gradual and slow, with no catastrophes. In my opinion, this uniformitarian geology, though scientifically bankrupt, has been the single most effective weapon ever produced against the Bible. Think about it. Did banning the Bible get rid of it? No. In fact, it only caused more demand for the book. Did burning the Bible get rid of it? Nope. Only made people want it all the more. Did killing off its believers, burning them alive, crucifying them publicly, imprisoning them, and destroying their Bibles make the Bible go away? Nope. It simply caused the other believers to scatter and take their Bibles with them to the ends of the world, further spreading the much maligned book. Yet today, when anyone speaks of this book as a literal history book of the life, the universe, and everything, the first thing that goes through the minds of most observers is, are you out of your mind? The earth is billions of years old. That book cannot possibly be true. That is the effect of uniformitarian geology. An anti-science weapon connivingly concocted by Lyell to discredit the Bible, and more specifically, as he secretly admitted in writing, it was a weapon to rid the world of the history of the great flood of Noah. It was Lyell who coined the phrase, "the present is the key to the past." How many of you have heard that phrase in your education? That phrase is loaded. How many of you have seen a global flood recently? You see, Lyell was trained as a lawyer, and he made use of an excellent lawyer's tactic to build his case. Notice that with that one simple, easy to remember phrase, he just disqualified a global flood from history because he argues that only present-day processes are allowed to interpret the past, and we don't have global floods happening today. You can count on it. In Genesis chapter 9, God makes a promise to the families coming off of the Ark of Noah after the great worldwide flood, promising to never again flood the earth. He sets a rainbow in the sky as a symbol to remind us of his promise. So we know that there will never be another worldwide flood as a present-day process. You see, one tactic that lawyers use is to not attack their opponent's case head on, but rather to provide a believable, alternate explanation for the facts. If you have a murder case with all kinds of evidence pointing to your client as the murderer, you would try to come up with a different story of the events which explains all the facts, which does not even involve your client. A powerful psychological part of that tactic is to never mention your opponent's arguments or case, because you are trying to distract the jury from your opponent's case. To directly address your opponent's claims head on, you are giving them and their arguments credibility and attention. By not even giving your opponent's arguments a mention, but instead simply presenting your convincing story to explain away the evidence, you cement your story in the minds of the jurors while simultaneously giving no credence to your opponent's story. This is precisely what Lyell did with his catchphrase, "The present is the key to the past." In one short sentence, he presented his case and ruled out a historic global flood from the picture without even mentioning it. He replaced history with his story, a story of deep time, millions of years, maybe hundreds of millions of years of present-day processes. Now, this is an excellent legal tactic, but is it scientific? Hardly. In fact, not only is it unscientific, it's not even pseudoscientific, but rather it is anti-science. Notice he ruled out possible scientific conclusions from consideration and ruled out huge amounts of scientific evidence from the research and modeling before the scientific hypothesis was even formulated. He simply disallowed it. This is the foundation of the modern day beliefs in deep time and long and slow geological processes. It is also the foundation of the evolutionary theory. That very foundation is corrupt and anti-science. Beliefs in deep time are fruit from the poisonous tree. In fact, as you will see shortly firsthand, the present cannot be the key to the past because present-day processes cannot explain what we find in the geological record. I would instead contend the Bible is the key to the past. For reasons known probably only by God himself, Charles had a severe allergy to anything smacking of catastrophe. So obviously the biblical record of the Great Flood of Noah triggered his anaphylactic reactions, seeing as how it was the biggest catastrophe ever to hit planet Earth. Now, we would not have known Lyell's secret intentions, except that after he died, his sister published his private writings and correspondence. In one letter, he wrote, "I am sure you may get into the quarterly review what will free the science from Moses, for if treated seriously, the church party are quite prepared for it. I had conceived of the idea 5 or 6 years ago, that if ever the Mosaic geology could be set down without giving offense, it would be in an historical sketch." Let me translate the Old English of that last part for you because it's profound. What he said was, I came up with the idea 5 or 6 years ago that if ever I was to discredit the geology according to Moses, the Bible, without offending its believers, I would do it by making up my own history. Did you catch that? Let me repeat it. I came up with the idea 5 or 6 years ago that if ever I was to discredit the geology according to Moses, the Bible, without offending its believers, I would do it by making up my own history. He would discredit this book by convincing people that his story was the one to believe, not the history of this book. And not only would he not offend believers in the book, he was confident the entire church would be swayed by his story. As it turns out, he was right. His anti-scientific tactic was so effective that we can even see and measure that effect throughout history. Where today, even Christians are convinced that the earth is billions of years old and that there was no global flood as described in the book of Genesis. In fact, Lyell's anti-science tactic was so effective, I personally believe the Apostle Peter prophesied about this great delusion that would come in the last days. Knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers walking after their own lusts and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. Gee, that sounds an awful lot like the present is the key to the past, doesn't it? But the apostle was even more specific. They were willingly ignorant of what? The global flood of Noah. This is profound. The Apostle Peter predicted a time in the end days where people would deny the historic global flood of Noah's time and embrace the idea that all things continue the same as they have from the beginning of creation. That is Lyell's uniformitarian geology summarized perfectly. As you will see over the first half dozen or so lectures in this series, we will visit and address Lyell's tactics, its effect, and the profound and overwhelming evidence for the historic global flood of Noah and why it matters so much. Lyell spent himself traveling the globe to find evidence with which to reinforce his new history. In 1930, he published his work as Principles of Geology, being an attempt to explain the former changes of the Earth's surface by reference to causes now in operation. The frontispiece of every edition of his book had this drawing of the Macellum of Pauzuli, a Roman colony marketplace originally misidentified as the Temple of Serapis. Now, including it as the frontispiece of every edition of his book, he obviously considered this site significant to his new history. The pillars were what caught Lyell's attention, as they were built somewhere around 100 AD. At some point thereafter, the entire area became dramatically submerged under the waters of the nearby Tyrrhenian Sea. And you can see these grayed areas on the pillars, which are basically pockmarks dug into the marble by a clam that lived in the sea. Presumably, the bottom of the pillar was protected by sediments that washed in when the whole area sunk below sea level. And thus, the sediments protected the marble from here down while the whole area was underwater. Later on, the land rose again up out of the waters. The whole area was then archaeologically excavated in the late 1700s. So when Lyell saw this, he was understandably thrilled. Here he was able to point to a series of historic events with profound significance. You see, in his day, everyone knew that the layers of rock we find all over the world were all the result of the great flood of Noah. Lyell sought to replace this thinking with his new history of deep time. So here he had this historic structure which, due to local subsurface volcanic activity, had dramatically sunk below sea level. Sediments had washed in, forming layers of sediments just like we see all over the world. Then, just as dramatically, the land rose again above sea level. So we didn't need a whole worldwide flood to produce these sedimentary layers we see all over the world. It could be done with subsidence. He argued that, contrary to what the Bible says, the seas didn't rise, the land sunk. Now, there was several problems with Lyell's proposition. Number one, if you sink the land below sea level, what do you get? A flood. Secondly, This dramatic subsidence of the land was catastrophic in nature, in complete contradiction to the deep time Lyell was trying to claim, and a perfect example of historic catastrophe that Lyell was trying to avoid. Lastly, what we know now that Lyell most likely did not know nor even think about is that these layers that we see all around the world can be traced continent to continent and traced to each other on the continents. So let's say Lyell's theory is correct, and it was actually the land sinking that caused these sedimentary layers, and not the waters rising to flood the world. Excellent! Those intercontinental layers indicate that all of the continents would have sunk at the same time. Well, if you sink all the continents below sea level at the same time, what do you get? A global flood. But Lyell's book and contrived arguments came across as very compelling and convinced countless numbers of people around the world that the Earth had been subjected to countless small events over millions of years, and that this book could not possibly be true. One of those people was a young man on board a ship called the Beagle. His name was Charles Darwin, and he was gifted Lyell's book by the ship's captain. Darwin read that book, and as he voyaged around the world, he began to view the world as though looking through Lyell's eyes. He now had his deep time in which he would put his theory of evolution now fomenting in his mind. He needed that deep time for evolution because evolution had to happen in long, slow, and gradual processes, just like Lyell's geological processes.
Coming up in the next Complete Creation.
Now, you can call Lyell's work and writings anything you want, as long as you don't use words like good work,